Hi, kids. The name of this chapter in Little House on the Prairie is called Indian War Cry. And I'm going to show you the picture. Next morning, Paul went whistling to his plowing. He came in at noon, black with soot from the burned prairie, but he was pleased. The tall grass didn't bother him anymore. But there was an uneasiness about the Indians. More and more Indians were in the creek bottoms. Mary and Laura saw the smoke from their fires by day, and at night they heard the savage voices shouting. Pa came early from the field. He did the chores early and shut Pet and Patty, Bunny, and the cow and the calf into the stable. They could not stay out in the yard to graze in the cool moonlight. When the shadows began to gather on the prairie and the wind was quiet, the noises from the Indian camps grew louder and wilder. Pa brought Jack into the house. The door was shut and the latch string pulled in. No one could go outdoors till morning. Night crept toward the little house, and the darkness was frightening. It yelped with Indian yells, and one night it began to throb with Indian drums. In her sleep, Laura heard all the time that savage yipping and wild, throbbing drums. She heard Jack's clawing and clicking and his low growl, and sometimes Pa sat up in bed listening. One evening, he took his bullet mold from the box under the bed. He sat for a long time on the hearth, melting lead and making bullets. He did not stop until he'd used the last bit of lead. Laura and Mary lay awake and watched him. He had never made so many bullets at one time before. Mary asked, "What makes you do that, Pa?" "Oh, I haven't anything else to do," Pa said, and he began to whistle cheerfully. But he'd been plowing all day. He was too tired to play the fiddle. He might have gone to bed instead of sitting up so late making bullets. No more Indians came to the house for days. Mary and Laura had not seen a single Indian. Mary did not like to go out of the house any more, and Laura had to play outdoors by herself. And she had a queer feeling about the prairie. It didn't feel safe. It seemed to be hiding something. Sometimes Laura had her feeling that something was watching her. Something was creeping up behind her. She turned around quickly and nothing was there. Mr. Scott and Mr. Edwards, with their guns, came and talked to Pa in the field. They talked quite a while. When they went away together, Laura was disappointed because Mr. Edwards did not come to the house. At dinner, Pa said to Ma that some of the settlers were talking about a stockade. Laura didn't know what a stockade was. Pa had told Mr. Scott and Mr. Edwards that it was a foolish notion. He told Ma, if we need one, we need it before we could get it built. And the last thing we want to do is act like we're afraid. Mary and Laura looked at each other. They knew it was no use to ask questions. They would only be told again that children must not speak at the table until they were spoken to, or that children should be seen and not heard. That afternoon, Laura asked Ma what a stockade was. Ma said it was something to make little girls ask questions. That meant that grown-ups would not tell you what it was. And Mary looked at Laura. Mary looked a Laura. Let me say that again. And Mary looked a look at Laura that said, "I told you so." Laura didn't know why Pa said he must never act as if he were afraid. Pa was never afraid. Laura didn't want to act as if she were afraid, but she was. She was afraid of the Indians. Jack never laid back his ears and smiled at Laura any more. Even while she petted him, his ears were lifted and his neck bristled, and his lips twitched back from his teeth. His eyes were angry, and every night he growled more fiercely, and every night the Indian drums beat faster and faster, and the wild yipping rose and higher and faster and faster. In the middle of the night, Laura sat up and screamed. Some terrible sound had made cold sweat come out all over her. Ma came to her quickly and said in her gentle way, "Be quiet, Laura, you mustn't frighten Carrie." Laura clung to Ma, and Ma was wearing her dress. The fire was covered with ashes, and the house was dark. But Ma had not gone to bed. Moonlight came through the window, and the shutter was open, and Pa stood in the dark by the window looking out. He had his gun. Out in the night, the drums were beating, and the Indians were wildly yelling. Then that terrible sound came again. Laura felt as if she were falling. She couldn't hold on to anything. There was nothing solid anywhere. It seemed a long time before she could see or think or speak. She screamed, "What is it? What is it? Oh, Pa, what is it?" She was shaking all over, and she felt sick in her middle. She heard the drums pounding and the wild yipping yells, and she felt Ma holding her safe. Pa said, "It's the Indian war cry, Laura." Ma made a soft sound, and he said to her, "They might as well know, Caroline." He explained to Laura that was the Indians' way of talking about war. The Indians were only talking about it and dancing around their fires. Mary and Laura must not be afraid because Pa was there, and Jack was there, and soldiers were at Fort Gibson and Fort Dodge. "So don't be afraid, Mary and Laura," he said again. Laura gasped and said, "No, Pa," but she was horribly afraid. Mary couldn't say anything. She lay shivering under her covers. Then Mary began to cry. Then Carrie began to cry, so Ma carried her to the rocking chair and gently rocked her. Laura crept out of bed and huddled against Ma's knee, and Mary, left all alone, crept after her and huddled close too. Pa stayed by the windows watching. The drums seemed to beat in Laura's head. They seemed to beat deep inside her. The wild, fast, yipping yells were worse than wolves. Something worse was coming. Laura knew it. Then it came, the Indian war cry. A nightmare is not so terrible as the night was. A nightmare is only a dream, and when it is worse, you wake up. But this was real, and Laura could not wake up. She could not get away from it. When the war cry was over, Laura knew it had not got her yet. She was still in the dark house, and she was pressed against Ma. Ma was trembling all over, Jack howling, ending in a sobbing growl. Carrie began to scream again, and Pa wiped his forehead and said, "Woo! I've never heard anything like it," Pa said. He asked, "How do you suppose they learned to do it?" But nobody answered that. "They don't need guns. That yell's enough to scare anybody to death," he said. "My mouth's so dry I couldn't whistle a tune to save my life. Bring me some water, Laura." That made Laura feel better. She carried a dipper full of water to Pa at the window. He took it and smiled at her, and that made her feel very much better. He drank a little and smiled again and said, "There, now I can whistle." He whistled a few notes to show her that he could. Then he listened, and Laura, too, heard far away the soft pitter-pat, pitter-pat, pitter-pat of ponies galloping. It came nearer. From one side of the house came the drumming, throbbing, and the fast, shrill, yapping yells, and from the other sound came the lonely sound of the riders galloping. Nearer and nearer it came. Now the hoofs clattered loudly, and suddenly they were gone. The galloping went by and grew fainter down the creek. In the moonlight, Laura saw the behind of its little black Indian pony and an Indian on its back. She saw a huddle of blanket and a naked head and a flutter of feathers above it, and moonlight on a gun barrel, and then it was all gone. Nothing was there but empty prairie. Pa said he was derned if he knew what to make of it. He said that was the Osage who tried to talk French to him. He asked, "What's he doing out at this hour, riding hell-bent for leather?" Nobody answered because nobody knew. The drums throbbed and the Indians went on yelling, and the terrible war cry came again and again. Little by little, after a long time, the yells grew fainter and fewer. At last, Carrie cried herself to sleep, and Ma sent Mary and Laura back to bed. The next day, they could not go out of the house. Pa stayed close by, and there was not one sound from the Indian camps. The whole vast prairie was still. Only the wind blew over the blackened earth when there was no grass to rustle. The wind blew past the house with a rushing sound like running water. And we're going to end there and see what happens the next night. So we're in the middle of the chapter, boys and girls. Can you imagine that? Do you think you would be so scared? I think I would be so scared. Okay, bye-bye.